The panel, as it were, today, I'm Neil Collar, planning partner at Brodies. I got my colleagues Elaine Farquharson-Black and Karen Hamilton, and our special guest Paul Macari from Aberdeenshire Council, that we'll introduce later on once we've had a bit of an initial chat through. So that was just the housekeeping arrangements. The podcast, as I said, it's the first time we've done this, and the idea was to move away from a webinar with slides and a very structured presentation and just to have more of a general chat. We were a bit inspired from the webinar at the amount of questions that we were being asked, and we could see that there was a real appetite for a discussion about what's going on in the planning system at the moment. So we thought it would be really good just to broaden it out into more of a general chat. As I'll mention at the end, we're going to do this regularly, and I'll mention the details for the next one at the end. And obviously, very pleased to have Paul joining us to talk about what's happening in Aberdeenshire. Just a bit of scene setting and context. As you'll all be aware, Chief Planner issued 2 letters on Friday. He'll have a bit of writer's cramp, I think, after all of that. One on planning procedures, one on development planning. The theme really being the overall theme, very much a general encouragement about keeping the planning system running. And we're going to touch on that sort of can-do theme on the way through. There was specific encouragement for planning authorities to hold virtual committee meetings. Some of you, like me, might have been sitting watching the Edinburgh Council DM sub meeting yesterday, done on a virtual basis, seemed to go very smoothly, and certainly the councillors had a real appetite for discussing things in as much detail as they always do, and the whole thing ran for well over 2.5, probably going on 3 hours. So no sense there of virtual fatigue that we've been hearing about with Zoom meetings. The Chief Planner letter also encouraging planning authorities to be supportive on changes to working hours in construction sites once those get going, and also looking favourably on temporary changes such as on-street seating for cafes and bars. Another little bit of news, DP on appeals issued an updated guidance note, and that was going into more detail on the undertaking site visits. I think the implication being they see more opportunity now as we're emerging from lockdown for site visits to be undertaken. So informing people what procedures they're going to be undertaking. So various things on the go, changes, and we thought it would be useful to start with a bit of a chat. That's all guidance, but actually looking at what's happening in reality. And one thing that struck me is the amount of pre-application consultation that's going on at the moment. Again, we've had guidance from Scottish Government about replacing public meetings by virtual meetings. Our client's Dunbar project in Dunbar, which is very hard to say, Dunbar in Dunbar, that had a virtual consultation yesterday. That's one of many, and we're going to hear more from Paul about what Aberdeenshire have been doing. It's not just developers who have gone virtual with consultation, the councils have too. Our planning team, we're still receiving a stream of instructions, a good mixture. There's no real sense of anything in particular slowing down or dropping off. Still plenty of clients wanting to do things. I mentioned the can-do culture, and something that really struck me was West Lothian Council put in a lot of effort negotiating with Registers of Scotland to get a Section 75 agreement registered for our client. Sadly, it's because she's terminally ill, but that was a real example of the can-do culture in work. Let's see what can be done to actually make something happen, rather than saying, oh, it's all a bit too difficult. So that was a few observations I had about what's actually happening. I'll pass over to Karen, and she can give us a bit of an update from her perspective.
To keep us busy, and we're getting a good mix of stuff from infrastructure projects, some offshore wind at the moment, mixed-use development. But it's been good to see, certainly in Glasgow, that the council are still managing to get decisions issued on some fairly notable projects around the city centre. And the officers, I think, are using their time, perhaps more desk time than they're used to work on things such as discharging conditions for consented projects. So all of that, I think, is pretty positive. We've been pretty busy over the last probably 6 to 8 weeks for one of our roads authority clients, working on the promotion of a CPO for them, a compulsory purchase order, which they had to get off the ground in pretty short order. So from a standing start, working with that team, we were able to complete all the land referencing, get the CPO itself prepared, the justification for that, carry out all the service on affected parties, and all of that obviously during the restricted arrangements that we're operating under at the moment. So that involved a bit of obviously understanding the regulations on what would or wouldn't be required under the COVID Act and under the compulsory purchase legislation. But it just shows you that things can still be achieved despite these restrictions. And I think in particular for that kind of project, a roads project with sort of walking and cycling benefits, it's going to be the sort of thing which authorities across the country will be looking to come forward at the moment to give a kickstart to the economy. So there are certainly good news stories out there.
I suppose picking up on, I was going to pick up on the CPO theme. I suppose I've been doing the other side of it, or further down the line, with the landowners, and still trying to work out, land tribunal claims, compensation claims for the land that's been acquired, mostly for the AWPR, but with other projects. So that's still been ongoing. And then appeals, I think I mentioned in the webinar, having various appeals at various stages, and whether they've been assisted, or whether we're still carrying on with the process. A number of those obviously relate to house building. So the decision that came out yesterday from the Inner House and the Gladman challenge there is interesting, and it's something that we'll be picking up as we go forward with those appeals in terms of the tilted balance. And it's interesting, just kind of briefly, that the courts come out to say that housing shortage is something which almost inevitably contributes to sustainable development. And that that shortage is going to be a significant material consideration, and the fact that you then breach one or two of the 13 guiding principles in paragraph 29 doesn't prevent the tilted balance, from coming into operation, and that the starting point has to be that presumption in favour of development, which is obviously the line that we take in the planning appeals, and thereafter. You look at whether any of the other policies significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the development. And then also some interesting comments in terms of calculating, whether there's a housing land supply or not, or the shortage, and doing that against the housing land requirement. So plenty to keep us busy up here too.
That's great. Thanks, Karen and Elaine. Just before I pass over to Elaine, who is going to interview Paul, not cross-examine, just to give him some comfort on that. I'm just reading, so this is always the problem of reading something at the same time as trying to talk. I'll maybe actually just mention this, because Elaine and Paul might want to touch on it, but you could maybe leave it to the end just so you've had a chance to think about it. But someone making the point that we've been talking quite a lot there about development management, planning applications and appeals, but concern about progress with development planning, and this is particularly in Edinburgh with City Plan 2030 and over 1,600 representations to be dealt with. And I think a specific COVID-related question about how spatial and design policies may need to be amended, particularly in relation to the brownfield strategy that was in the plan and the aspiration to significantly increase density. So it's more of a specific Edinburgh question, but Elaine, you might want to maybe touch on it on the way through with Paul about whether the proposed LDP that Aberdeenshire have just issued might need to be revisited just in light of new themes, different approaches that might be relevant following the COVID crisis. But anyway, that's just a thought that we could leave sticking to the wall. There's another question about CPO, but I'll hold that over and return to it at the end of your little interview slot. But just to remind everyone who's listening, please do give us questions and comments, and we will pick up on those on the way through. So Elaine and Paul, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I'm going to ask you to unmute. And thanks for joining us. And in the webinar that we did, there was a lot of discussion about the different approaches that various local authorities, various planning authorities have adopted or had to adopt. I think it's probably like with private businesses, we've all had to adapt, and some of us have found it easier to adapt to working from home compared to others. Now, I know, because we've had a lot of discussions, I know that Aberdeenshire put a lot of effort into keeping the planning system going. And I wondered if you could explain your thinking, at the outset, what you wanted to achieve, and then the steps that you've put in place for different parts of the application process.
Yeah, sure. I think right at the outset, within Aberdeenshire, we recognise that planning's got quite a crucial role to play, both within and beyond the immediate emergency. A well-performing planning system will allow for economic and social recovery, but it has to also be a sustained recovery. We have to recognise the social and economic benefits that come from development and how they help to sustain our communities. And therefore, understanding the role of planning both within and, like I said, as we come out of this crisis was really important. Some of the measures that we put in place, first and foremost, were to make sure that all of our staff were safe, so transitioning them from an office-based environment to a home working environment, but also reflecting upon the changes that we've undergone. So we have officers who are working at home while their kids are in the house. So adopting to a much more agile and flexible working pattern, while at the same time adopting an agile and flexible leadership style was equally important. Helping our staff achieve that work-life balance obviously enabled them to maintain their substantive roles in processing planning applications, maintaining the consultation on the local development plan. Obviously, to maintain decision-making processes, our Head of Legal and Governance within Aberdeenshire Council transitioned their committees from face-to-face committee meetings and LRB meetings to virtual committee meetings, LRB meetings, which also allow for full public participation. That's enabled our members to fulfil their decision-making duties, and also to enable the planning service to continue to process applications during this emergency period. We've also kind of, I suppose, moved away from face-to-face meetings, using virtual meetings more often, and in doing so, adapted new ways of working for site visits. Initially, we adopted a risk assessment and protocol to have our officers on site, but then recognising as well how we could share information that we gather from site visits, but also that could be brought to us by the development industry or applicants, agents, landowners, but sharing that information internally with internal consultees and external consultees that enabled them to respond to planning application consultations within the statutory timescales, but also enabling us to continue that process of determining applications. So yeah, we've adapted our processes and moved to a much more flexible and agile way of working. As has everybody, to be honest, and I think there's a lot of learning to be obtained from this process, not only from the way we've I suppose delivered resilience in our processes and practices, but also learning from the development industry and the way that they've also adapted to this new way of working.
Yeah. So one of the questions that came in from the webinar the last time was whether councils were still offering pre-application advice. And so just posing it obviously specifically to Aberdeenshire, is that a service that you are still providing?
Yes. 99% of our applications and pre-app inquiries right now are being submitted electronically, and therefore, because we've adapted our processes and practices to work in a much more electronic format, we're able to maintain our pre-app service.
Mm-hmm.
We might not always be able to meet the timescales given the difficult situation that many of our consultees and partner organisations are under, but certainly yes, our aim is to maintain the pre-app process.
And then kind of obviously linking to that, we've got no requirement now for the public meeting as part of the formal pre-application process, and we're into the virtual exhibitions. And obviously Neil touched on that, and the Scottish Government, as you know, on their website have some examples of what's been happening around the country. Are there any examples of pre-app virtual consultation in Aberdeenshire that you can kind of reference that you think might be useful for other people to copy or have a look at?
Yeah, of course. At the outset, agents and applicants who had maybe submitted a proposal for application notice or were considering submitting a plan contacted us for help and guidance as to how should they change and adapt their engagement strategy to a virtual strategy, recognising that it's a difficult time for everyone, and it was important to maintain consistency in the information that we were given to the development industry, our agents and landowners. So we created a list of what we would consider to be acceptable forms of engagement. And obviously we want to ensure that it's effective engagement, and that's been distributed to our agents and developers and landowners across Aberdeenshire. But off the top of my head, we have Thainstone Energy Recovery Facility, which is undergoing a virtual consultation. Castleton Farm is also about to undergo, I think, a virtual consultation. And also Park Quarry is undergoing virtual consultation. So yeah, there are examples of where we've adapted and changed our process and practices to be able to maintain the planning system and deliver that effective engagement.
And do you think actually we might see more people actually being involved in consultation? I've done the standing in a village hall, and not very many people turning up during the day to come and see it because they've got other engagements or commitments. Do you think we'll see actually a benefit that we'll be able to reach out to more people?
Yeah, almost definitely. I think the accessibility of virtual consultation, it really does reach out to a far wider audience than what you would usually achieve through those face-to-face events. People have very busy lives, and therefore their ability to go to work, drop the kids off, and then attend a consultation event is somewhat limited sometimes. There's a really great example that was just publicised by Colliers in relation to the former Freescale site in Holbeath in Dunfermline. They had a face-to-face public event that was attended by 56 people, but the virtual event was attended by 3,000 people. I mean, that just shows the scale of engagement, but also the reach of a virtual consultation.
And of course, your virtual consultation, you're now exploring with Aberdeenshire Local Development Plan. You've taken that, and that's one of the ones that's actually highlighted on the Scottish Government webpage. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about how you see that rolling out and the different aspects to it?
Yeah, I mean, right at the outset, we kind of understood that there would be restrictions in place as a result of COVID-19. And so we consulted with our development industry, our landowners, agents, and spoke to our community councils to ensure that everybody would be in a position to continue to either process planning applications or actively be engaged within the consultation process of the local development plan. Given that 90% respondents, confirmed that they were able to maintain their engagement in the planning process, we then started to look at ways in which we could deliver our consultation so we could maintain the process. It was really important to ensure that the aspirations that we had actually met the aspirations of our customer base, essentially, as a local authority. So the first thing that we started to do was work out how to engage virtually. So it's all very good advising the development industry and the private sector to engage virtually, but we also have to lead by example, and we have to change our processes and practices. So we have to adapt from a face-to-face consultation to one that would be virtual. We entered into an agreement with ACOM, who have helped deliver a virtual town hall for us, which displays all the documentation associated with the proposed plan online. There's a live chat facility, so anybody who enters the virtual town hall and reads the documentation, if they have any queries, they can contact a member of the team at any point. And unlike the face-to-face consultation, that information is available 24/7 for the duration of the consultation. So again, it's not just about being more accessible in terms of that contact and reach. It's about the availability of information. So we'll have that virtual platform. In addition to that, our plan can be viewed in different formats. We'll have a story map developed, and really, I mean, it's recognising that previous consultations perhaps didn't reach as many of the demographics across Aberdeenshire as what they could have. So one of the things that we've done is open up the consultation to our primary and secondary school pupils with activities contained within it, and that allows them to engage. The most important thing about engagement in a local development plan is that it's effective, that you reach as many people as possible. We want as many responses as possible to ensure that the plan is the right plan for Aberdeenshire.
Now, you normally get quite a lot of responses to Aberdeenshire Local Development Plan drafts, and obviously we've just heard that Edinburgh 1,600, whatever. Are you estimating that you will be in the thousands if you're with the kind of virtual consultation?
I don't want to put a figure on it, but yeah, I would anticipate that we are going to get a large number of responses, and it's important that we have we adapt our timescales and our resources to be able to respond to each representation that's received, but also that we can ensure that we can prepare the plan and get it sent off for examination as soon as possible. We want to maintain the development plan scheme as best we can. There's an awful lot of land deals, there's contracts that all hang in the balance as landowners and developers wait for the plan to be approved. So yeah, it's quite important to us.
And is that then part of the decision to not, for example, run your local development plan consultation period for as long as the city? I mentioned it in the webinar last time, the difference, obviously cities running for 14.5 weeks. You're a wee bit shorter than that.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, I think both Aberdeen City and Shire would have ran their consultation simultaneously. And therefore, there would have been quite a lot of pressure on landowners, developers and agents to get their responses into both plans within the same time period. The city have decided to extend the period for consultation over 14.5 weeks, and perhaps that creates opportunity for developers and landowners and agents to prioritise their submissions to each plan. But in addition to that, we'll have to take into account that there has to be an element of flexibility, and certainly we've built that into the development plan scheme. and taking cognizance of the advice given by the chief planner, we have provision for a 2-week extension to the consultation if it's required. But in addition to that, if any developer or agent or landowner or community council or community group is experiencing difficulty in maintaining the timescale for submitting a consultation, get in contact with us. You know, we're more than happy to help, and where a reasonable extension can be agreed, then yeah, we'll make that happen.
No, because that's useful, because obviously we've still got some people are still furloughed at the moment. I know I can see that there's a number of questions that have come in that I'm sure Neil's going to do. I'm going to give you one last question, and it's, you know, you did speak about at the beginning about things that have changed. When we go back to the new normal, whatever the new normal is there one thing that you've seen that's changed, that you've had to change, that you'd like to see going forward, that would become part of the new normal?
Yeah, there's a number of changes that I think have come forward that are excellent. I think we touched on earlier the electronic registrations. I think, you know, previously the process for registering Section 75 would have taken up some time, but I think we've got examples now of it actually being completed within an hour. So I think that's fantastic and can really expedite the process. I also think that the level of collaboration between the public and private sector and the learning throughout the last 10 weeks has also been fantastic, with great examples throughout the country of coordinated delivery. So I think it's really important that we maintain that momentum. For a long time, I've said that there's so many lessons that the private sector can learn from the public sector and vice versa. And therefore, I think it's really important that we maintain that momentum and continue to develop in that way.
Neil, do you want to pick up some of the questions that have come through?
Yes, I will. Paul, you'll probably not be surprised to learn there were a lot of questions on the way through about you sticking with the statutory time limit for responses to the LDP and specific reference to the furlough period. But I think you really dealt with that. So I don't think anything really said on that. There was also a question picking up on your comment about the Collier's example of virtual consultation and the increased numbers, and the person saying, was there also an opportunity to change the demographic reach, particularly in relation to younger people? But I think, again, you actually answered that on the way through, because you were talking about, in particular, the schools and the school pupils. And there's plenty of other things, so that's why I'm just sort of noting that those were mentioned. But a particular question that was raised, which coincidentally came out of our chat just before we went live, what is happening in Aberdeenshire about site visits for planning applications? Yeah,
we've developed a protocol and a risk assessment, so that our planners can assess sites, attend site visits where it's necessary to do so. We're also looking at virtual site visits at the moment and creating a protocol, learning from the practices of other authorities and suggestions that have been made by applicants and agents to us. It's important that we maintain everybody's health and safety during the emergency, and as such, we're working towards resolving that. We will hopefully return to site as soon as possible. The planners are off site just now as we regroup and learn from our experience of attending site. So it's important, like I said, that we review our processes and practices that we've put in place and ensure that when the planners do go on site, they're keeping themselves safe, but also the people that they might encounter.
Yeah, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the DP guidance goes into quite a lot of detail about how reporters are going to do site visits, including, interestingly enough, situations where they might need a colleague. So it was interesting to see, and I think it probably came from a similar sort of health and safety sort of risk-based assessment process. A different aspect that was raised what changes, if any, have you made to the enforcement function, and have you seen any spike in unauthorised works? And I suppose actually a follow-on from that might be, now that people are spending more time at home, are people actually spotting more enforcement problems, or perhaps in their walk round the neighbourhood?
We've not seen a spike in enforcement complaints within Aberdeenshire. In terms of our approach, it's very much still a pragmatic approach to planning enforcement. It's very much about negotiation and discussion with with complainants, but also anybody who's carrying out unauthorised development. If it's we try to assess any complaints as a team to make sure that if the development's unauthorised and if it requires planning permission, we're giving out the right advice, not asking for planning applications to be submitted where they necessarily would be refused, allowing us to follow the process as best we can, and obviously provide the help and guidance to any complainant or any would-be developer.
Yeah, and following on from that, I touched at the beginning the guidance from the Chief Planner about the sympathetic approach to temporary issues, and I appreciate you've only had that since Friday, so it's a bit premature maybe to be asking too much about that, but what do you see maybe as the challenges for the planning system dealing with social distancing going forwards, and the implications? The pavement cafes are maybe an easy example in one sense, because we've had pavement cafes, and it's largely going to depend on whether there's enough space. But what other issues do you see coming out? It's almost the new agenda, as it were.
Sure. I mean, I think we've actually been working on this for a wee while, recognising that in order to create a sustainable recovery, that there's going to be changes to all sectors. So within the council, we formed a working group that involves representatives from planning, development management, transportation, trading standards, environmental health and licensing. So we can almost provide that one-stop shop of advice and guidance, consistent advice and guidance to the different sectors as they adapt their business practices and try to recover. The challenge is as always, consistency in the advice, but also recognising, that the decisions that we take, for example, in implementing the Spaces for People programme, how will that then impact on creating space for businesses then to perhaps move their activities and operations outdoors, and then what impact does that have on space for people, pedestrians and cyclists and things. So it's about understanding the implications and really joining the dots and thinking through the issues as they arise. But yeah, certainly making sure that there's consistency across the council, so that the advice you get from planning isn't then contradicted by the advice you'd get from another service within the council. That's certainly the approach we've taken.
I think just picking up on that, because I've just had an hour and a half call on city centre recovery in the city, in Aberdeen City, and it is so many different parts to it, because as soon as you need more space, you're taking up, a bus lane, and then you're having to stop cars, but then, what's happening to the bus route, and then it's, as you say, it's licensing, it's environmental health. I think, planning authorities and the authorities in general are being, very good in terms of the approach and recognising there are so many things to balance, but, they're trying to get businesses back, trying to get the public back into, into the centres. And I think it's been, very encouraging to see everybody working together to try to get that to happen, because it's all having to happen in very short timescales. We're planning for phase 2, but we don't actually know if phase 2 is going to be, starting from the 18th or the 19th of June. So it must be quite difficult for the authorities. You're having to plan, but you don't really know the date.
Yeah, and a very interesting question here, moving the discussion to a slightly different angle. I'll maybe just read it out because it's a bit multi-layered, so can't really summarise it. do we think that local communities will have a greater role to play in the planning process and leading to economic recovery, particularly if a lot of people are working from home and so perhaps will be more inclined to get involved? So interesting suggestion there of we might actually now be more interested in our local communities because we're spending so much more time there. And so it's particularly if a lot of people have the opportunity to get a greater say in planning issues affecting them at a local level, and then taking that forward into whether that would place a greater role for local place plans with the potential to increase their importance within the system. So, as I say, a bit multi-layered, but it's really focusing on that aspect of can we actually see greater public engagement because there's more interest in our local area?
I think in terms of the new Planning Act, I think certainly it was about engagement. It was about opening up planning to get people more involved, to get communities more involved, certainly with the introduction of local place plans. That was the main aspiration. I think as well, though, you know, the COVID crisis might have been, you know, coincidentally allowed people more time to get involved in local issues that affect their community. But certainly, I think from our perspective in Aberdeenshire, we always want to engage with as many of our communities as possible. In fact, for the local development plan, our officers, as well as being available for live chat, they're attending all the community council meetings virtually at the moment. And that was one of the key aspects in the plan. It wasn't always about making sure that consultees and making sure that the development industry could engage, but making sure that our communities still had that ability to engage in the planning process. So yeah, if people are being directed towards our community councils, towards engagement within the planning process, I think that's something that we should definitely support, and again try to ensure is maintained throughout the as we emerge from the emergency period.
Do you not think, Paul, in that there's also then got to be very strong messaging coming out from the local authorities on the economic aspect and the need for regrowth? I think there's always a concern that local place plans will, you know, potentially be anti-development, and so I think it is great you have more people involved, but there needs to be that strong messaging that development is good. You know, we've got that Gladman decision, you know, making it clear that housing development, you know, is got strong economic benefits, you know, and that's relevant. That messaging will need to get out to the, you know, to the communities.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the planning process is there. The Planning Act's there. It creates a framework for decision making, and I think, you know, it's important to reflect on the process that's already in place. I also think it's equally important to recognise that the development industry, landowners, agents, they all form part of the community, you know, and so their involvement within the formation and formulation of local place plans is also essential. Especially if, you know, when you take into account the demographics and the geography of Aberdeenshire and the distribution and the different scales of community, but also developer.
Yeah, interesting question that someone asked, which I think neatly dovetails on, and it's maybe a bit of wishful thinking. Can we see a situation where the development plan engagement is going to get to a level where we're actually going to get less objection to planning applications?
It's a good question.
It is. I mean, it's maybe slightly utopian, but actually, if the cogs came together, I don't think it's an unrealistic expectation. Not no objection, but certainly less objection, or maybe just more objection to the detail rather than the principle.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the build-up to the Planning Act, there were, I suppose, thoughts that were put forward, both from within the public sector and the private sector, on how you could radically change the development management process. And part of that was kind of a movement towards local development plan and these alternative consenting schemes.
Yeah, Yeah.
There's some need for care in all of this, that in embracing all the virtual processes at the moment, and in following the relaxations that have been allowed by Scottish Government, that other sections of the community who perhaps don't have the access to perhaps the same facilities, internet, whatever, are not disenfranchised, then we perhaps get a bit of a reversal from the typical communities that perhaps participated in the process before, that may be more shut out as a result of the processes being used at the moment. I think there's maybe also a need for some care that planning authorities take care that there's not an over relaxation at the moment in terms of processes that are being followed, with the changes, the temporary changes that are allowed by the various COVID acts, that authorities aren't perhaps neglecting some of the remaining legal requirements that they need to follow. I think there's perhaps some evidence that that may be beginning to creep in, albeit understandably, but it does raise a risk of challenges further down the road, where some of the black and white requirements aren't being followed.
Yeah. We've got a couple of minutes left. I do want to try and finish it on time. So, Elaine, can you maybe give us a few comments on the practical implications of the Gladman decision? Because somebody did mention that as a question. Do you see it as having issues for housing, land supply and delivery of housing?
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, if you've got a planning appeal that relates to housing land supply at the moment, it's the approach that most of the appellants would have been taking anyway. It's now, it confirms that when you're looking at the housing shortage, and looking at that, you look at the housing land requirement, plus the flexibility. It'll be interesting to see what's picked up in NPF4, because of course we're waiting for NPF4 to be setting housing targets. How is that going to be, set? How's that going to have regard to, the Gladman decision? We've seen that being pushed back out, so it's now going to be September 21 before we see the draft. So in this period, with development plans and, getting elderly, you're going to see, I think, much more reliance on this in terms of development plans that are over 5 years old, and, your shortage in your 5-year land supply.
Yeah. And then just to wrap up, and we can maybe all say something about this. There was a question picking up just generally on planning reform and culture change, and saying, was there anything that was previously in the too hard box, which is now perhaps much higher on the agenda and seen as a priority? I think if I maybe put in a starter for 10, I think the opportunity we've had to literally stress test procedures means that a lot is being learned. And actually, I always felt, while there's useful things in planning reform, a lot of the problems could be changed with just minor changes to procedures, and looking at very perhaps small scale, but actually potentially quite important things like just discharging planning conditions. And I think the changed focus now is helping delivery, and there's some good things there which hopefully will be maintained or enhanced, or certainly taken forward. So I'll throw it open. I don't know, perhaps just to save you virtually looking at each other, Paul, do you maybe want to go first, and then Karen, and then Elaine?
Yeah, I think the opportunity that's been presented by the current situation, it's kind of created a platform for us to launch from, in terms of looking at all the different aspects of what we do procedurally, the types, for example, the types of conditions we put on decisions. It gives us the opportunity within Aberdeenshire to certainly look at that and try to streamline the process. I'm a firm believer in front loading the development management process to reduce the number of conditions you put on a consent, but in addition to that, to also addressing and creating that alignment between planning and road construction consents. But at the same time, we also have to be, our communication skills have to be really first class in order to be able to convey the level of information and the detail that's required in order to front load the system. Because if not, then we're sending out mixed messages to the development industry. And I think from my perspective, that's certainly something that I would look to kind of focus in on from Aberdeenshire and look to improve.
I can't remember now. Who did I suggest was next?
I'll pick up on communication, which Paul has mentioned, and to the extent that we're able to still make things work at the moment, it's so reliant on good communication. And I suppose casting minds back to 6 months ago, and perhaps seeing amongst planning authorities more and more difficulty in having direct access to officers, where perhaps there's not a possibility to pick up a phone to an officer just due to resource constraints, etc. Things can't work well under those circumstances. And I think the more that we're reliant on electronic processes, the more there is a need for the likes of planning portals to be absolutely up to date, well maintained. The need for transparency in the paperwork and good communication is I think underlined more than ever. So I don't want to say the R resources word again, but we just can't get away from some of that stuff. But it does underline the need for the continuing work on the digital transformation.
I suppose then, just to wrap up, it reminds me of the comment, and Paul and I talk about this quite a lot, and it was made at one of our seminars, conferences that we have, and it's a comment that John Lowe of Robertson Homes, Vice Chair of Homes for Scotland, always makes, and he said, about the planning system and the reforms, you've either got to change the people or change the people. And I think we've all probably changed, in terms of this, and we've had to change, and we're probably all a bit more understanding of the difficulties that other people are, coping with. And I think I said it in the last webinar, we have become more collaborative, and I think that's the bit that we've got to keep going, and the bit that's got to, carry on and continue to work. Paul's obviously referenced, learning each in, the private sector and the public sector, learning from each other, and working forward. We can't lose that. That's the bit, as I say, it's maybe taken a pandemic, but we've got what John wanted. People have changed.
Yeah, so that's a really good positive note for me to start winding things up. I probably have overrun a little, but apologies that I didn't manage to get to all the questions that were asked. We had over 20 questions, so I've done my best, and we'll have a look at the ones that weren't answered, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to you individually. Just in terms of reminding you that we're doing another one of these in 3 weeks' time. It's on the 25th of June. So if you could join us again, if you've got any feedback that you want to offer us, not fashion tips or comments on our backgrounds or anything, but any issues you'd particularly like us to cover, then do get in touch. And if you want to pick up on anything that we mentioned today, the contact details are just up there on the screen. As I said, we have recorded this, so it will be available on YouTube. I keep thinking that must make me sound trendy that I've got stuff on YouTube, but I suspect YouTube is now old hat, and we should all be on TikTok or something. We'll look into that. But most importantly, to say thank you to Paul. He told us he didn't dress up specially for this. It was for a previous meeting. but we are very grateful that he gave up his time, and it was very interesting to hear from him about the perspective from Aberdeenshire and what they've been doing to grapple with this crisis. So thank you very much to Paul, also to Elaine and Karen, and thank you all again for attending. So we'll now say goodbye and hopefully see you in 3 weeks' time.